Welcome back, baseball fans, to the Canadian Baseball Network podcast. Today, Jackson, we're doing the post-mortem, the autopsy of sorts that was the what was the Blue Jays season.
Well, and it feels like the season has been over for a minute, right, Matt? And now, because I mean, it basically ever since like what, July when they sold, we knew that this was kind of the path they were going to go down, retooling, whatever you want to call it. So people have had lots of time to let their feelings marinate, let's say, about management, about the
Some might call
team.
it a slow, painful death. I don't know.
Yes, exactly. Death by
Being-
1,000 paper cuts.
You're being maybe a little kind.
But yeah, so it'll be interesting to see kind of how this offseason goes. We are here to discuss that as well as, recap what was a largely disappointing season, but with a couple bright spots here and there, I guess.
74 and 88, fifth in the AL East. Like you said, a few bright spots, some bad and some downright ugly at times. Yeah, where do we start? I'm glad we didn't do this right away. I think, like you said, to let it sit maybe for a few weeks and now kind of dive into it. Ross Atkins and Mark Shapiro have done their postseason press conferences. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this watched that and may have more questions than answers.
You can tell, like, with this fan base right now, I've tried to like not go on social media too much this summer, this season, Matt. I've tried just not just like baseball, really, just generally. I think social media is bad for our brains, but one thing I didn't quite grasp until recently when I did kind of get back on was holy crap. Like, I can't find a single person that likes Ross Atkins or Mark Shapiro or the job they've done. Now, I can't say I blame them, but this fan base is very angry right now, right? Dare I say they have the pitchforks in hand, right? These press conferences that Atkins and Shapiro had, it's as if they didn't know who they were talking to. It's as if they thought that they had done a good job this year. I mean, they kept saying disappointing, disappointing, disappointing. I don't mean that quite literally, but just in the tone and just in the things they said and just the way they conducted themselves, it was very run of the mill, Matt. It sounded exactly the same as it has every other year. And coming off such a disappointing year when you had such a big payroll and such high hopes, I think a lot of people felt like, do you guys even know what's wrong here?
I don't want to play devil's advocate because it was disappointing. It was
Yep.
frustrating. I don't think a good job was done by many people within the organization. Obviously, I'm looking from the outside in. But to be fair, a lot of what I heard, first of all, you can't be surprised.
Mm-mm.
We've seen these guys talk before. It was the same old thing. But at the same time, in their defense, and I know people don't want to hear this, it's front office talk. I
Yeah.
mean, certain things they're not going to say. People really jumped all over Mark Shapiro about not calling Vladdy a generational player, mentioning Pete Rose, which they thought was interesting, having 200 hits 22 times or whatever the case was, or whatever the numbers work out to be. But he's also got to go into arbitration with Vladimir Guerrero Jr. And sometimes if it gets to arbitration, those conversations can get a little testy. And I don't think Mark Shapiro wants to be on the record calling Vladimir Guerrero a generational player when there's millions of dollars on the line. Now, the flip side to that is you're probably squabbling over a few $1 million. So is it worth it? In which case, I think no. But regardless, it's front office speak.
Yeah, and on the Vladdy thing, that was interesting. Good question by whoever asked that, because you knew you were going to get an interesting answer no matter what. Um, yeah, arbitration is a nasty, nasty business, right? It can get ugly. We've seen it in other sports. I mean, hell, we saw it in baseball with Corbin Burns, right? Corbin Burns was like, I did not like how that went. The Brewers traded him. Like it happens in hockey. You saw it with Jeremy Swayman in hockey. I think that you're right, Matt. His dad was an agent. He's been in baseball his whole life. He gets it, right? You're not going to call him a generational hitter. And I think what he said was largely correct, right? That he is a good player, but generational players, you don't really know. Like it takes a long lot of games. And like we're talking like, we're talking generational, and that's like some of the best players ever. You aren't going to put Vladdy in that conversation, honestly, and that's okay. So one thing that did strike me, I thought Shapiro did a better job than Atkins at the business speak. I think that Shapiro already does a good job of kind of dancing around questions and not but not entirely avoiding them either. Whereas with Atkins, it felt kind of like he was just puking up all the points they told him to say The season's on me. We need to do better. We're going to look into our processes. We're going to investigate everything, right? That's kind of all he really said, right?
Processes. Everyone's gets so sick of that term. I mean, it's good in theory if you communicate effectively what that process is,
Mhm.
but I think that word just gets thrown around within this organization with their 10 different hitting coaches and analytics department, and no one really knows. I hope they know because I don't think anyone on the outside has a clue what process they're following.
Well, and how good is your process if it leads to 74 wins, no playoff wins in 8 years? You know, so they fire the hitting coach. Let's go over. So they fire the hitting coach Guillermo Martinez, right? To much applause from some fans, which I always find it strange to be super happy when a guy loses his job, but I'm sure he'll be okay. But still kind of sucks for him. Bullpen coach Jeff Ware, field coordinator Gil Kim have been removed from the major league coaching staff. Uh, Sounds like they weren't quite fired, but they're sort of been moved around and they are free to go to other teams. So some changes on the big league staff, but largely, Matt, let's be honest, moving around deck chairs. I always thought kind of the last couple of years, the hitting coach kind of got a lot of crap that I don't think he necessarily deserved. In our recent episode of this podcast, we talked about the Canadian Future Showcase, right? And about how, hitters come through and they're trying their best and they're trying to raise their stock. And we got to remember these are major league hitters. So they've been through a lot to get to this point. They've been through a lot of coaching. They are self-motivated. You have to be to get to the big leagues. A hitting coach isn't going to tell them, okay, time to be bad now. No more home runs. Don't hit for power anymore. Like the idea that that was the case was always ridiculous. And you could, yes, there is a correlation that when Don Mattingly got here, the lineup started to hit for less power. Yes. But there's a lot more to it, like, roster construction, underperforming players, right? I I don't know about you, Matt, like how you felt about the whole hitting coach thing getting fired. To me, okay, go for it. But the real change will always happen with the roster.
There's a saying for this, shit runs downhill.
Yeah.
And who it falls on first, who's at the bottom of the hill? Usually guys like the hitting coach, assistant hitting coach, the manager, and then it usually works its way up at that point. That's exactly what's happening here, I think. Uh, yeah, sure. I guess people are really not happy with Martinez, how much impact he actually had, how much say he had. Um, the talent wasn't there. We had this conversation during the preview, and we talked about how 5 through 9 in the lineup wasn't going to produce a lot of offense. They focused on run prevention. They kind of doubled down on that by bringing this roster back. Run prevention's fine, but look at the playoffs right now. There's home runs going out of ballparks all over the place. And the low-hanging fruit comment about the power, well, if it's low-hanging fruit, why wasn't it picked? Am I the only one that thought that when he said that? Well, why then that should be an easy. You're just saying this now, 14 months after, getting bounced in two in the playoffs, and you knew power and offense was a problem. I don't understand. I think that was a stupid well, was a stupid comment that didn't make any sense.
And you got to remember, like, because then you talked about how, like, in the playoffs, you need contact oriented players. Well, playoffs is just about home runs and strikeouts, right? That's largely like you want your pitching to strike guys out, but you want your hitters to hit home runs, right? That's pretty much what the playoffs
We
is.
just saw we've seen Fernando Tatis Jr. hit moonshots,
Yeah.
and that chaos happened at Petco and Dodger State all across the playoffs. Like you need the 3-run home run at some point. You're not gonna string together hits in situations like the playoffs off top starters where everything is magnified. Everyone is that much more locked in. Playoff baseball isn't the same as the regular season. I don't care what you say. Any playoff is different. There's more focus. There's more, intent behind every little maneuver. It's under the microscope. It's just the way it is. So to say that, power is low-hanging fruit and that you need contact in the playoffs, you do need contact, of course. You don't want guys striking out 15 times a game, but you need the 3-run home run and you need the pitch, you need a good bullpen. Two of those three things, arguably potentially three of those three things, they didn't have.
Well, and even like Pete Alonso, like he's done with the Mets. How about old friend Teoscar Hernandez hitting a grand slam to get the Dodgers back in the game? It's hard to string hits together in the postseason, right? Like, it feels like we've been talking about this for a year and a half, 2 years, Matt. And I think that that is where the fan base, after this press conference, people were pissed off because they're kind of, especially Atkins, doing the same old dance, right? Kind of, this sounds very familiar. Like Just go get Tyler O'Neill and Santander and some relievers, and your team is probably a lot better, right?
Yeah,
That's like 60 home runs and some strikeouts.
I'm sure Carlos Mendoza was really hoping Pete Alonso was going to work a good at bat in that Brewer game. No, he wanted him to get a pitch he can handle and drive it. That's exactly what he did, and look what happened. Now the Mets, who on paper have plenty of flaws, I think a lot of these teams in the playoffs have plenty of
Mm-hmm.
flaws, have caught fire. And what are
The
they doing?
Tigers.
They're hitting the ball at the ballpark and they're pitching.
Yeah.
Uh, a lot of them. Sean Manaea just had a great outing.
Mm-hmm.
Sean Manaea is not a top 10 starter in the Major League Baseball. I mean, it's just mind numbing that you think you can construct a roster that way in 2024. And the game is changing. Speed, contact is certainly coming back into it more. But you get to the playoffs, man, you got to bang. As Joey Votto would say. Those are the teams that really do damage in the playoffs.
You can look to a million different examples. You can look here at home in Toronto. Two of the biggest hits in franchise history, three of the biggest hits in franchise history are home runs. Joe Carter, Jose Bautista, and Edwin Encarnacion, right? Those are all home runs. Now, of course, home runs are big moments. But what I'm saying is like those were all the playoffs and those were all huge hits and led to Jays wins. Like, you know, I think that it's just he's wrong. That point was wrong, and I don't want to question Ross Atkins in terms of like I'm not trying to disrespect. Sorry, Ross Atkins. He's a baseball executive. He's been in baseball his whole life. I think a lot of fans didn't get that, ourselves included. But one thing too that kind of relates to that, but also doesn't. You look at some of these teams in the playoffs, Matt. The Detroit Tigers, the New York Mets, the Kansas City Royals, Cleveland Guardians. The Jays had over like a payroll over $200 million, right? You couldn't build a team better than these Detroit Tigers and these Kansas City Royals. I know the Royals have Bobby Witt Jr. and he's playing out of his mind. He's a great player. The rest of that lineup outside of Sal Perez, nothing really there. I think that's also why the fans are upset. You could also look at Baltimore and say, well, it doesn't always work out, but Baltimore had hitting issues all year long. That's the issue, I think, is people think, okay, you've got this huge payroll. Rodgers is investing heavily in both the stadium and the team, and you can't build a team that gets to 85 wins and knocks out the Detroit Tigers out of the playoffs. You can't do that even.
And this is the problem, I think, when you talk about extending Vladdy. The payroll doesn't sound like it's going to go down next year, which is fine. But do they now think maybe we don't need to shell out $300 million for Vladimir Guerrero? Because look at the Tigers. The Royals might be a bad example because they did lock up Witt, but look at some of the Guardians, lower payroll teams. They're making noise in the playoffs. So that may be a little concerning heading into the off season in the next year as far as because it doesn't sound like an extension with Vladdy is anywhere close. And again, we're not behind closed doors. Maybe it is, but it doesn't sound like they're in too much of a hurry to get that done.
Yeah, and like you would think that a Shai Davidi or a Nicholson Smith or somebody would have come out and said, hey, these talks are progressing or these talks are happening or whatever. And every time, I mean, it's been a while since we talked to Ben Nicholson Smith. That was in the summertime, but we talked to him and he said there's been absolutely nothing. There's been no conversations going on. And that doesn't even include the Bo Bichette conversation, which is completely different. But yeah, like you brought it back to an interesting point in that, like, even if you sign Vlad next year, your payroll isn't going to be like, it's not going to change that much because in arbitration, Vladdy's already making so much.
Pegged at 29.6 or something.
Yeah, and that's probably what he'll get or close to it each year on a long-term deal. If you give him 10 years, 300, or even 10 years, 350, which is maybe too much. But, it's going to be in that ballpark. So your payroll, you're already almost paying him what he's going to be making on that long-term deal each year anyway. So, we're kind of getting into the weeds here a little bit. But the point is, like, you have a great opportunity. The payroll in this city has never been larger, right? This is the most that any ownership group has ever invested in this team. And what do you get? You get 74 wins. So I get the apathy. I get the frustration in this fan base. I don't get the focus on the hitting coaches more so than the actual players on the field. Alas, Matt, there's a lot of work to do. And, it's really hard to see, with this, if you're not going to get power in your lineup, how are you going to make this lineup that much better than it was this past year? I'm not sure. Winter and snow in Canada usually means no baseball for a while, but thankfully, the Baseball Zone has you covered during the holiday season because their 2024 Snowball Baseball Camp is here. For those aged 5 to 13, it's a great way to spend some time out of the house, having fun, and learning something. The snowball camp includes thorough baseball instruction in all areas, great camaraderie and competition, home run derbies and other games, a TBZ t-shirt, and a bonus daily day pass for extra work and fun after the camp if you haven't already had enough. It runs December 27th through the 30th and January 2nd and 3rd. You can pick and choose which day you'd like to attend. Space is limited, so sign up early for the 2024 Snowball Winter Baseball Camp at thebaseballzone.ca.
Getting into the offseason now, which is obviously the next big question. How does Vladdy play into that offseason? If you're Anthony Santander and do you want to sign a 5-year deal if you don't know where Vladdy or Bichette stand in this lineup? If you're Tyler O'Neill or, they're not going to be in on Juan Soto more than we didn't think they were going to be in on Ohtani either. So let's not, completely write that off the table. I don't think that's going to happen, but do you want to sign somewhere where the best players aren't locked up long term either? Does that make any sense and maybe it does for some guys, maybe some guys will chase the most money that they can get and that's that. But, for ones that, are focused on winning, may not be the best scenario.
There's a reason that Jose Barrios put a opt out in his contract after 2026, right? Because he saw the writing on the wall back then, which was, okay, well, this team could be in a very different place, by then. And, I might have been onto something. You mentioned Juan Soto. I think it's an interesting point. How would a player like Juan Soto, how would they even entertain a Toronto without Vladdy there? You know what I mean? It just feels like Vladdy is your ticket to improving your team. And to me, there's no way forward without Vladdy in your team long term. I just don't see it.
I get the sense that with Soto, and again, I'm not trying to get people's hopes up, but we sat here joking about Ohtani last year, and that turned out to be a viable chase. So
yeah,
I think whoever cuts the biggest check for Juan Soto is going to get Juan Soto. That likely, probably the New York Mets, or potentially the Yankees, but that's a dynamic franchise-changing bat. So one can dream, I guess, if you're a Jays fan.
One of the best left-handed hitters ever. It would be a hell of a coup. And to get him from the Yankees, right, to take him away, he would fit this lineup like a glove, right? He would hit second or third. Who cares whether you want him in front of Vladdy or behind? Let's see what happens. Yeah. And then you pair, we're getting crazy. If you extend Vlad, you give Soto some money. That's a lot of cash already, though, right? You got some other holes to fill. But hell, if Rogers is in for a penny, they might as well be in for a pound. If you're going to go get Juan Soto, you got to compete. You can't just go get Juan Soto and say, well, that's it. So the assumption would be much like when they were chasing after Ohtani, you're going to add more than just Soto, and the budget is going to look very different. I will say though, Matt, this feels like he's not going to leave New York. It just feels like the Yankees are going to come through with the Godfather offer, and they're going to get it done. So we don't need to focus too much time on that, but there are other names. I mean, Willie Adames is kind of a fun name out there.
That plays in the Bo Bichette issue.
Yeah, right.
You turn Adames that, you can turn Bichette into something.
All of a sudden, yeah. It's hard to see with Bichette. I don't know what's going to happen with him because his market, do you ever want to trade a player at their lowest value? No. But at the same time, he's only got 1 year left. So that ship has almost sailed. I think at this point, it's probably more likely than not he starts the season as a J, even if that's not ideal for everybody, just because of sort of that value proposition. But I mean, hell, there's been a lot of stuff online about how the Jays were in on Lindor, right? The Jays have been on a variety of plays, Corey Seager. I think they've shown that they'll go and get a shortstop, even if they have one, and sort of make the pieces fit.
And I think that's where Ross Atkins and Mark Shapiro deserve credit.
Mm-hmm.
Because people obviously look at this past year, an absolute disaster, and they get tired of hearing, oh, they made the playoffs so many times, but they don't have any playoff wins, obviously. But it's the same front office that brought in Kevin Gausman, George Springer, Hyun-Jin Ryu, made the trade for Barrios, Chris Bassett. I mean, so they've gone out and they've done some things. It's not that they're not sitting on their hands, waiting for things to fall into their lap, in the front office. They're willing to go out and do stuff. Obviously, last off season, with 2 off seasons ago when they got rid of Gurriel and Teoscar Hernandez, that kind of backfired. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they're active.
Under those same lines of kind of crapping on Atkins and Shapiro whenever people can, I would also urge people to remember who acquired Teoscar Hernandez in the first place, right? And who turned him from a quad A outfielder who had major strikeout issues into a premier power bat in the major leagues? That was the Jays. That was Ross Atkins, right? Let's not get too carried away here with the Atkins hate. The only reason we know of Teoscar Hernandez is because the Jays made a really nice, tidy piece of business there.
Yeah, if you want to criticize, you have to also have to be ready to praise. And I know recency bias kind of plays into that, and it's what have you done for me lately? And rightfully so. That's the way the sports business works. But at the same time, they've done a lot of things to bring in pieces for this current roster that have really helped them.
And the Lindor thing, yeah, they were close, right? Apparently they finished like second. The Cleveland just liked the Mets package better. They were in on Corey Seager, right? That number, the Texas Rangers just paid him whatever the hell he wanted, right? They were in on a variety of players. They were in on Freddie Freeman, right? Yes, Otani, okay, that whole they were in the mix. Like the idea that they're not willing to get good players. And yes, they finish second. They don't close the deal. That's a criticism right now, right? They don't close the deal. There's a lot of front offices you could point to if we knew all the inside info. They haven't closed a lot of big deals, by the way.
I think the
Like,
Jays, the only second place team, and on Lindor, Seager,
right.
Otani, I wouldn't. That criticism kind of rubs me the wrong way. Yeah, when that gets brought up. I mean, a lot of teams finish second. It's like the minor league system. Not everyone hits like the Baltimore Orioles or the Chicago Cubs or you know. But regardless, so what do they need realistically? Looking at the roster, I mean, you made some points here. You're looking at catcher, power bats. You kind of already touched on. I think a guy to watch is Christian Walker,
Mhm.
baseman and playing for Arizona. Play for Arizona. That would move Vladdy to third, which would
Mhm.
kind of shift up the defensive alignment. But again, a power bat at first base, power bat at third base. Horwitz plays second. Now you can kind of see an infield coming together.
Yeah, Horwitz and Orelvis Martinez can potentially platoon, right? And or another bat in the mix there. Yeah, and then if you go, like, let's say again, just having fun here, it's Christian Walker and Tyler O'Neill, right? Tyler O'Neill goes to left field where he can play a corner. You got Varsho in center, and then you go and get a catcher, right? Whether it's a Carson Kelly or I don't know, is Christian Vasquez out there? Like you're just getting a catcher who's solid, a decent. You don't need a ton of production there, right? You hope that if Kirk can kind of build on his end of his season and continue that, but there are a lot of holes to fill. I'm curious to see how much they fill via trade though, because a lot of these young infielders, like, are they really all going to be on the team next year? I feel like a few of them are probably going to be packaged. That'll be interesting to see kind of what trades they make. That'll obviously inform their free agency decisions and whatnot. But
Yeah, there's too many infielders. I mean, you
yeah,
just look doesn't take someone working in a front office to see that. And I think some of these guys really impressed this year in limited stints. And maybe you sell a little bit on the higher end on some of these guys, whether that's a Will Wagner or a Leo Jimenez. Obviously Horowitz is probably penciled in the opening day lineup, but Spencer or Addison Barger, that may be a piece, but there's too many guys that aren't going to fit, and you don't need all of them. At some point, you got to use this depth to help the big league roster if you want to win.
I look at that Joey Loperfido. I like him as a player. I just wonder if there's a team out there that's willing to give up a nice relief arm or something, a power hitter for a package that includes him. Yeah, I'd be really interested to see that. The other thing then is Vladdy at third. You briefly mentioned it. Like, is that something we obviously don't know? They haven't. John Schneider mentioned that they were comfortable with it in spurts. If he was playing there every day, though, like an everyday third baseman, I don't know. But boy, that sure would help your lineup if you could go get a Christian Walker or another power hitter at first.
If you get someone that goes and hits 35 home runs and 100 drives in 100 at first base, Vladdy's playing third. I can tell you that right now. And you're gonna either learn to like it or learn to deal with it. That's just how I see it playing out. It just depends what comes their way in the offseason, but I don't think that should be a hesitation if the right move comes their way.
Or even when they were chasing, when there was that talk about if they're going to get Freddie Freeman way back in the day, and where would Vlad play if we're going to get Freddie Freeman? Well, there was a talk about maybe he's going to have to play some third. He came up as a third baseman, right? He's moved to first and it's worked, but I wonder how malleable they are willing to be there because that would obviously help them out a ton. You look at the bullpen; they're going to need help in the pen as well. Obviously, that's a little more kind of cut and paste, right? You just go and get some guys who can throw 100. You're going to need a couple lefties. Jordan Romano's health there is obviously huge. Where is he at come spring? He had surgery this year. Who knows?
Yeah,
So
and you look at a lot of these bullpens in the playoffs, even you don't even know who some of these guys are.
yeah,
You don't follow the game closely. There's probably fans out there thinking, "Who the hell is this guy? He's throwing 99 with a nasty split, right?" So you definitely have to focus on it and go and try to make it better, but I don't think it's something that you dump a ton of money into. Same as the catcher position. I think somebody to platoon with Alejandro Kirk. If Kirk can play 80, 90, maybe 100 games, I think that's fine.
Mhm.
I wouldn't run him out there for 120 or 130.
I don't think you could.
You saw how that kind of played out when he was the starter when Jansen was hurt this past year. But those are two positions where I think you can, I don't want to say go to the clearance aisle and pick some off the
Mhm.
scrap heap and hope something works. But you see relievers filtered in and out all through spring training, and you kind of see what works. Go get a couple core guys, like you said, Romano's gonna be back. Swanson may have a bounce back year. If they re-sign Ryan Yarbrough, that's another good piece in the pen. So there's some options there, and there's going to be some guys on the market for that's not going to break the bank.
And you would have hoped that there would have been more options internally. And I think there are a couple, but injuries have sure hurt that, right? Like, that, it would have been cool to have Ricky Tiedemann as an option, right? Maybe late next season, maybe, but probably not. Alek Manoah, obviously, in a bit of a different category, but numerous pitching injuries like that just have really hurt them at the worst time, right? When they needed the bullpen depth and the help, when the vets weren't doing well, they just didn't have it, right? And Shapiro mentioned that. I guess that was what his post deadline, or maybe that was close to the end of the season. His press conference, he talked about how the bullpen had let them down big time. And I think that as a result, I think that will be addressed. I think it makes sense. They'll sign one guy, make a couple trades for a couple more, and then maybe they have a nice internal story or two. That's baseball bullpens in a nutshell these days, right? You look at the Dodgers bullpen, for example, you got Michael Kopech. Well, they didn't have Michael Kopech till the trade deadline, right? You never know how these things play out. So I think the big picture question is which power bats you add, how many, right? If they add any at all, like last season, if they had just spent the money that they used to get Kiner Falefa and Kiermaier, and they instead signed Teoscar Hernandez, I would have loved to see how this season would have gone. And I'm not saying it would have changed too much. It probably only changes a couple wins.
They're
But
a
the
better
fan
team.
perception, they're a better team. The fan perception, just how things work out, you got to wonder, right? Um, I like Christian Walker. I think that's a good one. I like Santander, but his market is probably going to be pretty robust. But still, to take him from an AL East rival would be awesome. Tyler O'Neill, the same thing with the Canadian angle in there as well. Is there any other power bats that stick out to you, Matt?
I think the power bats, I think you got to be careful because you want to maintain flexibility at the DH spot. George
Mhm.
Spring's still on this roster making a ton of money. You don't want someone pegged into that spot. You need
Yeah.
someone with some defensive versatility. You're going to want to use it for Vladdy every once in a while, especially if he's playing third. So I think you got to be, but yeah, Santander, Tyler O'Neill, that would be a cool Canadian connection on top of what he can bring on the field. Juan Soto, did I mention his name yet? That would be pretty neat, I think. But yeah, I'm not holding my breath on that one. But yeah, the guys that we mentioned, I think Christian Walker, I think those are going to be the big guys. But who knows? Again, trade. You didn't think Teoscar Hernandez or Yuli
Lourdes.
Lourdes Gurriel, sorry, watching the Royals. Um, Lourdes Gurriel, we're going to get traded in the offseason. So who knows what could happen?
And I think it kind of brings you to this conversation as well of like, we talked about last episode or an episode we were talking about Jays where it was the executive out in Seattle who said, you're only aiming to win 54% of the time. If we can win 54% of the time over the span of X amount of years, we'll be okay. He got roasted for that comment. It was a brutal comment, PR wise, but I do think it's a window into how some of these front offices think. I don't know if the Jays necessarily are targeting 54%, but it's kind of what contention is these days, isn't it? Like you're just trying to get into the mix, like the Tigers. You're trying to get into the mix and get hot at the right time. The Mets did that this year.
Diamondbacks. I mean, that works.
Yeah.
That happens. I mean, have a good enough team to compete. And if you get in, look what can happen. I mean, I hate to say that because everybody wants to obviously win the division, and that's a lot of things can happen. Really is, especially in baseball. There's so much variability to it that you get in and anything can happen.
And that's why it makes it really interesting to see what they do this offseason. Do they go crazy and spend a ton of money and make a ton of trades and really kind of shift this roster, move a bunch of young players out and really transform the team? I doubt it, right? I think you see more of kind of what we're talking about. You sign a player or two, you make a few trades, and you hope for better luck next year. Like it's not the sexiest offseason, right? Obviously, you want to go get Juan Soto, and then we're gonna go get the best starting pitcher on the market, and then we're gonna trade for Emmanuel Classe, and it's going to be great. But that's just not how, unfortunately, it isn't franchise mode. And I don't want to talk down to anybody because that happens way too much in Toronto baseball media as it is. But I will say, I would have probably let go of Atkins prior to this offseason. But let's give the guys a chance. Like Anthopoulos wasn't exactly universally loved here before he had a good deadline in 2015. Sometimes that's all it takes, man. Like they say less is more. I'm not saying that's the case when constructing a roster, but I do wonder truly what does contention mean anymore and how far away they really are.
I think they can go and get a couple power bats, and the whole conversation changes around this
Mhm.
front. So they go and get Santander and Christian Walker, and Vladdy moves to third, and they pick up a couple bullpen pieces that can help. I mean, you're talking about a completely different team rolling into spring training next year. I mean, and that's all it takes. Again, recency bias. What have you done for me lately? They go win
Mhm.
the division. Atkins and Shapiro might be signing extensions.
Wouldn't that be something? Hey, if they come out, they win 95 games next year but again, comes down to the playoffs, right? And so I will say one thing though, Matt, and we might have talked about this last episode. I would expect more movement than years prior in the offseason just because of the pressure on these two guys, especially Atkins, right?
Yeah, and I think, if you're him, if you feel like you're kind of on the hot seat, which everybody seems to think he should, if he's not, he should be. I mean, why aren't you being more aggressive? Are you
Yeah.
going to be here 5 years from now if you don't figure it out now? So there's also that aspect of it as well.
And that's where you could see sort of in the midst of all this desperation, you could see them moving Vladdy to third because it's like, well, this is kind of what we got to do to get some more power in the lineup. Yes, it's not great defensively. There's a higher chance he gets injured, sure, but it's sort of like that all hands on deck approach that I I think there's a variety of reasons, Matt, why fans don't like this front office. They replaced Anthopoulos in the first place. They talked all about player development, and then they didn't really follow through on that. They've made some bad trades. They made some good trades. The one thing they have done a good job of is getting ownership to spend on the team, right? That can't be denied. And they have been in the mix on some big players. They've gotten some. They've lost out on most as that happens. But I think we're going to see kind of the rubber hit the road. I think that's the term, Matt, when it
I
comes to
think,
this front office.
I think we said that at the end of last year, but I truly believe it's kind of it. If they roll in with run prevention as their
Oh,
motto in spring training, it's not going to fly very well. They need to start winning some baseball games. They need to make a deep run. Whether that's a World Series or not, that's hard to do. You need a lot of luck to be able to do that as well, and things to bounce your way. But they need to go on a run. There's no doubt about it. There's a ton of work to do, and honestly, if I had to predict it, I don't think the work gets done because I don't know how easily it will be attainable.
yeah, and as much of a on the field, goal is to get the team better, but also just from a fan perspective, a PR perspective. Shapiro mentioned, meaningful games in September. I just hate that term because it means that and it kind of relates to the whole 54% thing, right? You're just trying to get in the mix. You're not trying to win the division. You're not aiming for the division. Your goal should be winning a championship, not playing meaningful games in September. Yes, you have to play meaningful games in September to get to the championship. But that phrasing and that to me, that's where they're doing themselves such a disservice with the fans because it's like meaningful games in September, man. We want a World Series.
The organization's past that point. It
Yeah.
passed that point 2015. It's about winning and winning championships and hanging banners that aren't wild card series wins. Yeah, it's going to be interesting, but I guess that's kind of is that an optimistic outlook that we just discussed or pessimistic? Or I guess I'll hold, I'll hold my comment on how optimistic I am for a few months and see what happens through the GM and winter meetings and what Atkins is able to do.
I'll say it, Matt. I have faith. Loosely. I don't have a lot of faith. I have some faith. Let me recorrect. I have some faith.
Loosely. That's
Yeah.
very encouraging. I'm sure people will be very happy to hear that. That's a wrap for this Toronto Blue Jays wrap on what was not very good season. I'm sure some of the best part for some people is that it's over. But spring training is just around the corner. At least I'll tell myself that until February. Stay tuned right here. We're going to have all kinds of great guests throughout the winter. Baseball's always on the top of mind for us. So stay tuned and thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out Canadian Baseball Network for extensive and comprehensive coverage of the latest in Canadian baseball. And the Baseball Zone, Canada's leading instructional baseball academy and training home to thousands of MLB pro, college, and youth baseball players.